If you remember from the first episode of my podcast, my guest then, Stark Ashara, said that the magic is in the doing. My guest today, Ben the vegan farmer, I think embodies just that. He is a true regenerative farmer that uses veganic practices. He runs a 501c3 nonprofit animal sanctuary and is also a vegan activist who holds live debates on his social media. Now, there's this old saying that goes, those that say it cannot be done should stop interrupting those currently doing. And Ben is the type of person that I point to as an example of one person who is currently doing. We discuss the growing concern over H5N1, as well as the symbiotic relationship that he holds with local predators without sacrificing the safety of his sanctuary animals. We also discuss the environmental impact of modern-day agriculture, and if you are feeling somewhat anxious or overwhelmed by the sense of impending doom that is the climate crisis, I invite you to listen to some practical solutions to at least do everything that you can do to do your part. So as always, if you get value out of this conversation, please consider subscribing, start a discussion in the comments down below, and like this video if you want to see more like it. I feel like I need to offer everyone in the audience a little bit of context into this episode, which is that we recorded this once before. We sat down back in, God, I don't remember when that was, like September or October sometime.
Yeah.
And we talked quite a bit about a lot of different things. And it was a really interesting and a very compelling episode. I loved that episode. However, there's been a few things that have happened since then. So, number one, Hurricane Helene. You were in the path of Hurricane Helene, not in the direct path of the most damage necessarily, but you were in the path in South Carolina. We even discussed our love of Asheville during that episode. And it is heartbreaking to hear all of the awful things that have gone down with not only the hurricane, but also the insurance industry and a lot of the other stuff. And like Asheville is not going to fully recover from that for a long time.
Yeah.
Which is heartbreaking. So I want to touch base on that. And then now, of course, we are recording this episode in early January, like literally January 1st. Today is New Year's Day, 2025. And the H5N1 is becoming something that I am paying a lot more attention to. And I will say I'm alert. I'm not anxious, but I also want to learn as much as I possibly can. So, Ben, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast and re-recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And Happy New Year's.
Yes, Happy New Year. Yeah. Did you guys do anything fun for that?
Not really. We like to do like a planning session on our New Year's and kind of just hang out with the family and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, when you say planning session, like what do you mean?
So we do like a kind of retrospect. So we like to look at, old pictures from the last year, kind of look at last year's goals that we had. Since we do have so many farm and sanctuary projects and so many, content creation projects, we like to, appreciate the success that we've had. And then we get into kind of a planning session about, next goals, setting goals for specific projects and things like that. So that's kind of our New Year's tradition.
That's awesome. Okay. It's kind of like a Spotify Wrapped, but like for real life about stuff. Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it. Okay. So let's dive into a little bit of your story, your background. So for anyone who doesn't know you, can you share a little bit about your journey to becoming Ben the vegan farmer? Like what inspired you to adopt this lifestyle and then focus so heavily on sustainable farming?
Yeah, so I grew up in the deep country, as you'd say. I was really big into fishing and hunting growing up. We always had a garden as well, like a small, garden that we'd can food, growing green beans and okra and, Southern traditions like that. So as I got older, I really got into technology. I worked in the software industry for quite a long time. But I found myself like noticing health issues that I was having, not very severe things, but I was also seeing health issues within my family and friends as well. So I got really interested in like, not necessarily nutrition, but just like healthy eating. My family my mother actually has a background in dietetics. So, I had some understanding of basic nutrition, but I really got interested in, the health aspect to diet. And that kind of started shifting me towards a plant-based diet, as well as like my love for the environment and focusing on environmentalism. So I was really interested in, reducing my consumption of red meat and animal products like that for health and environmental reasons for quite a while. And then I actually met my wife, and she had been vegan at the time for about probably 5 or 6 years. I had never met a vegan before, right? So this was a brand new thing to me. Like, wow, like somebody's surviving, on a vegan diet. That's wild. So the ethics and stuff were kind of introduced to me. And at the time I was still like hunting, not very much. But I really had to confront that kind of conditioning that I'd received, throughout my life about hunting and treating certain animals a certain way. Always loved dogs and cats. Actually had a rescue dog and cat. But that realizing that it was unnecessary, and then further looking into some of the impacts on ecology and the environment from hunting kind of made me really reconsider the ethics. And then through kind of a breakthrough moment while hanging out with the domestic bunny, my wife's bunny, I made a connection to that lack of empathy that I had for like these wild rabbits that I was raised to hunt, versus this domestic rabbit, that was my friend. So that was really like the ethical switch for me. So I've been vegan now for 4 years. I've also co-founded, I guess you could say, animal sanctuary with my wife. So we've been doing that for almost 4 years as well. And I've been doing some online activism and stuff like that for about a year now. So trying to get a little bit more involved.
Yeah, I hear you. That's awesome. That's also interesting that you were saying that you had never really like met a vegan before. I'm sure you may have seen one in passing in the wild. But I joke with my wife because I'm from Texas originally. For anybody who knows me, my wife is from Maryland. And so when we met, there's this running joke where I'm like, I found the exotic Catholic of the world and brought her into my family, which is kind of funny because it's kind of the same for you. You found the vegan, the rare bird, as it were.
Yes.
But that's awesome. So your wife has been vegan for how long now total?
I think she is at 10 years now. But I'd have to double check with her. But yeah, we actually have a very close vegan anniversary together because hers was coming up as I made that connection with her bunny Lucy. And then I really dove in and, just like started studying, looking into scientific studies, as well as lots of different documentaries, Dominion, What the Health, like all of the health related ones and the ethic, documentaries that I could find. And I was just like, I'm convinced like this is the time, so I decided to make that important change.
That's amazing and good for you. Those documentaries can be incredibly powerful. Yeah. There's a number of them that I watched that definitely helped to shape exactly where I am as well. So, all right, so let's shift gears a little bit. So with one of the big things and the anxiety that we're all feeling around H5N1, I think that we all have a little bit of PTSD from coronavirus, COVID-19, during like the lockdowns and the pandemics. And I am starting to see a lot of parallels, which makes me a little bit nervous. So I wanted to talk to you, a farmer who has an animal sanctuary, which I feel like you offer a really unique perspective into this right now. So with that alarming rise in the H5N1 bird flu cases, even in backyard flocks, like, how concerned should people be about this trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very concerning trend, with the current state of our food system, like being heavily reliant on animal-based, industrialized agriculture. We're kind of making this problem a lot more worse with those issues. I don't think there currently, at least to date right now, is human-to-human transmission, at least that I've seen, but as with viruses, the chances for mutations as it does infect other animals does increase the chance of it potentially becoming, a mutation that can be human to human. So it is something to be concerned about. It's very important to know, especially if you have chickens or cats that would go outside for sure, as well as dogs and other animals, to be kind of aware of what to look for. In chickens, it's respiratory issues. In cats, it's like lethargy and lack of eating. So it's really important, to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on this and making sure to, protect our families and our animals, from potential infections the best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the more interaction that a virus has with people, essentially, the more chances it has to do that mutation, and essentially, we want to shrink that possibility as much as possible.
Yeah.
So you mentioned animal agriculture with this, and I mean, it should be no surprise to anybody that listens to this podcast at this point. Like, I very much do support, a plant-based diet as well as the vegan movement and community. But removing all of my biases aside, can you? If you could please remove all my biases, like with that in mind, like walk us through, like, what is it specifically about animal agriculture that presents a problem with these types of diseases?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a multifaceted issue. If we kind of reverse a little bit and look at the COVID issues and other zoonotic diseases, a lot of times these are, perpetuated by a lot of the ways that we have land use in general, not necessarily just animal agriculture, but human encroachment on wild spaces, and stressing of, wild animals, which can increase the chances of, spread of viruses, both in those animals that are being stressed, but also to other animals in the area as well as humans. So with animal agriculture specifically, though, we're looking at a lot of confined animals in these industrialized concentrated feeding operations. Are huge breeding grounds for these types of issues. Again, we have stressed animals, potential even antibiotic resistance at some points, but I think the biggest thing is the confinement and the stressed animals in these conditions. So the chances that they get infected and then spread to other animals in these areas are really high. We're also seeing some reports of improper PPE usage inside of these industrialized farms for the cleanup, which further exacerbates the potential for human, infection, and improper disposal of these animals. Not only are some really unethical ways of, culling these animals happening, but also the disposal of these animals' bodies is oftentimes being done in improper ways, which furthers the risk of spreading to other wildlife or stray animals. So it's really not a good situation in that kind of animal agriculture field right now.
Yeah, that is, it's one of those things every time that I kind of think about it and zoom out a little bit and kind of think about all the confined space and how that is quite literally just one infection turns into, potentially thousands.
Right. Yeah. And to be clear, none of the parts, it's not very much safer to have even small operations, right? And, a lot of people will look at backyard chickens and things like that. But if your chickens are free roaming and in contact with wild animals, or wild birds, you are increasing that risk. So we're taking the best precautions we can to make sure our animals don't come in contact with wild animals, especially while there are outbreaks like we're currently seeing. So that's something really important to consider as well, is a lot of people in our area let their cats outside, and then let them back inside maybe, or they're fully outside cats. But still, right. Having a cat or even a dog that's outside unattended, the potential for them coming in contact with a bird that might have been infected, is pretty high. So I think in these situations where outbreaks happening, those are also things we need to be considering as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And and with the cats too, I've even heard a lot of people talk about the neurological symptoms that cats are having, and it has a pretty high mortality rate, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. That's the reports I've seen as well. That's pretty concerning. Especially in our area, with the stray cat populations. In rural areas, there are tons of these stray cats that are going to be coming in contact with birds. So that just further increases the chance of, cross species, infections.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with that being said, so how do you feel like the health of our ecosystems, like wetlands and forests, would impact the spread of diseases like this?
Yeah, I definitely think that's of concern as well. A lot of the land use practices that we have, and as well as the pollution and contamination that we have, from not only animal agriculture, but other, human systems as well, further stress these ecosystems. And stressed ecosystems are more likely to have, these contagious outbreaks, especially stressed animals. I think that's another reason why I think it's so important to be looking at the whole system in general, and land use, and figuring out how we can, better protect these areas, these wild spaces, to make them healthy ecosystems and encourage healthy ecosystems, rather than continuing encroachment, and degradation of ecosystems. So.
Yeah, and you've mentioned land use a couple of times. So kind of like take the average person, the everyday non-farmer, through like land use and like what you're talking about specifically.
Yeah, so land use, if we look at the land use within agriculture specifically, around 80% of our land for agriculture is devoted for feed for animals. That does include pastures and hay production, but so much of our crops that could be grown for humans are actually being fed to the 90 plus billion animals that we slaughter every year. So it's really important to understand that context, and to also understand the context of how much like calories that amount of land is contributing when it is processed through animals then into humans. I believe some studies point towards like 18%, comes from that 80% of land use and through the animals to humans, of calories, 18% of calories for humans. So we're still getting a large majority of our calories from plants, but we spend so much land and agricultural kind of resources towards raising animals for a smaller amount of calories. So, if we care about conservation, if we care about healthy ecosystems, if we care about, devoting, areas to wildlife, I think animal agriculture and specifically land use within animal agriculture is really important.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. God, what was it? Cowspiracy, I think, was one of those big documentaries, kind of talking about documentaries that kind of helped to shape us. And one of the things that they talked about in that documentary that I found to be so interesting was talking about like the majority of grains that are grown in the United States actually go to feed the animals so that we can eat the animals.
Right.
And so when you think about that, you think about all the resources that are required to grow grains, corn, soy, wheat, whatever other products that they eat, and then transporting that to those factory farms for the animals. It's essentially taking plant food, filtering it through the animal, and then just eating the animal as opposed to eating that food. Because that is also food. We could just use that amount of land. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, there was that connection that my brain never made until I really watched that documentary, and then I was like, oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah, and I think for me too, as I was kind of transitioning more into a plant-based diet, I was still under the impression, which I think a lot of people are, that like more regenerative type animal agriculture could be beneficial, right, to ecosystems and to ecology, right, because it is kind of marketed that way in a lot of the grass-fed and regenerative type animal agriculture systems. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, like, the land use is actually way worse, compared to, feedlots and industrialized animal agriculture. So if we do care about land use, we also need to be considering that regenerative animal agriculture is contributing far more to land use for, again, less calories than we could be using, that land for if we were just consuming the plants. So
yeah, you bring up a really compelling point, and I've talked about this quite a bit, where it's like, the number one cause of Amazon deforestation is to clear Amazon rainforest for grassland, so for grazing land, for raising cattle. A lot of people don't make that connection that, yes, something like a grass-fed cow may be more natural. We can agree to say that it's more natural to have a cow that's, grazing grass. However, the impact that has due to the amount of mouths that we would need to feed is massive. And there isn't even enough land on the planet for everyone to eat something like grass-fed beef.
Right.
Like, it takes up massive quantities of space in order for that, which is an interesting split, because like I feel like this day and age we all care a great deal about wanting to be as natural as possible, which I think is coming from a good place. However, we also need to understand that natural doesn't always necessarily mean better. Natural, sometimes in this particular instance, it would be even more unnatural to try and raise these types of animals for mass consumption. And it would quite literally clear out biodiversity because we would have to just make room for grazing land.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of a nice little segue. So let's talk a little bit about biodiversity. I've heard you speak about this on your accounts. Now, can you explain a little bit about how biodiversity or the lack thereof in modern farming might impact disease resilience and overall just sustainability as well?
Yeah, I mean, biodiversity and ecosystems is really important for ecosystem health. Having this term trophic systems, if you do study biology and ecology, you'll learn about trophic systems and the different kind of levels within an ecosystem, from predator down to like prey or even plants at the bottom. And having a healthy balance within these ecosystems allows for healthy fluctuations in the different, populations of these animals, and it will overall help with the ecosystem health. And when we have healthy biodiversity, we don't typically have issues with carrying capacity or disease or parasites. These issues are a lot more mitigated through the healthy food web that already exists in these ecosystems. And one thing in veganic agriculture is the type of agriculture that we practice here on our farm. We do care and we look at biodiversity as a critical part of our farm, because we can reduce our pesticide usage and our need for additional inputs into our agriculture systems by relying on biodiversity. So through having healthy biodiversity on our farm, we actually are able to have predatory insects, that'll come through and help with the pest insects that would be taking out our crops. So that's something that a lot of even just industrialized plant farming, what I would call conventional agriculture, but definitely animal agriculture overlooks to a huge degree. And you will see within the regenerative animal farming community a focus sometimes on biodiversity, and they do try to focus on this within the grasslands, but again, they're ignoring so many different things, like methane for greenhouse gases, as well as just the alternatives to land use, in that area. So, if we were using plant farming or plant-based agriculture, the potential for biodiversity is actually increased because we can have more space for wildlife, for wild animals, for insects, than you could in these conventional systems, whether it be animal or plant-based conventional systems.
So what role do you think that like regenerative or plant-based farming play in creating a much more resilient food system as well?
Yeah, I think it is extremely important for the resiliency in our food system. If we're looking at the contagious infections that we're seeing, like H5N1, or other potentials for zoonotic diseases, I think that's critical. To be looking at the comparison between just growing plants versus having concentrated feed operations, even if it is the worst type of plant farming, monocropping with synthetic fertilizers compared to industrialized animal farming, you can still even see huge benefits to a food system that would just have monocropping. Now, within veganic agriculture, we try to get away from monocropping as well, and do integrated plantings of diverse species of plants rather than just one field with one species of plant. So historically, I've tried to kind of reclaim that regenerative label, because there is a lot of animal agriculture industry trying to take that label and really apply it to the animal industry. So I've kind of started moving a bit more away from that, and we're currently working on our veganic certification, which is a certification program here in North America that you can get. Yeah, so we're doing that. And we're not using any animal byproducts, no animal manures, no bone meal, blood meal, any of that sort of stuff that would be considered animal byproducts. And there's a lot of benefits to it outside of just biodiversity, and I mean the climate and environmental impacts can be greatly reduced through, a lot of these practices and the thing about veganic agriculture is that it essentially is regenerative, just without all of the animal based stuff, right?
Right.
And it's a refocus on like really the broader picture of compassionate and ethical farming. So that's why I'm trying to use veganic a lot more than regenerative, just because it is a lot more descriptive. But I also find that I think it's still important to try to reclaim that regenerative label too at the same time.
I agree. Yeah. So years ago, I worked as a manager of a health food store, and I cannot tell you the amount of products that I saw that were just entirely greenwashed. And it was everything because, millennials and younger are very conscious consumers to a degree, but we still fall for marketing every now and then, which of course, like we all do, like everybody does, right? But I would see things that would say like, 99% regenerative, bone broth or something. And I was just like, I don't know how that could possibly be true or how you could really even give a percentage to. Anyways, yeah, it's just craziness of products. They'll put anything on a package to sell it. That's for sure.
That's true.
So for anybody who doesn't know, what does veganic actually mean?
Yeah, so veganic is essentially taking those regenerative properties, removing the animal-based products. It is heavily focused on replacing synthetic and chemical, additives that would traditionally be used in agriculture as well. So like synthetic or chemical-based fertilizers, the removal of herbicide or pesticide usage, and really focusing on the kind of working with nature rather than against it. And also applying those vegan ethics to the situation where we do want to completely minimize, if not eradicate, like crop deaths that we can by different practices, as well as like trying to I mentioned not using pesticides. I think is a huge part of it. But things like no-till agriculture can also greatly reduce crop deaths. I think it is just essentially better for the environment, and it's a far more ethical, way to approach agriculture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't know veganic was like completely free of like pesticide usage too. That's super cool. Because a lot of people. Oh, sorry. Go right ahead.
No, I was going to clarify. Like there are some exceptions, but typically the recommendations are to try to use, methods like using netting on your crops. Or deterrents, but again, like focusing on the biodiversity in your area, building pollinator areas and habitat for beneficial insects is typically the route that is mostly encouraged. And so part of the veganic certification sometimes can be like helping farmers figure out how to do that and how to shift away from certain pesticides, but you can't get certified veganic if you are using these heavy pesticides. I think sometimes there are allowances for certain types of things, but again, that's something through the certification process that you kind of have to work with depending on your farm.
Okay, so it's not necessarily like pesticide free, but it's without using a lot of the heavy hitters that are known to cause some of the problems.
Right,
okay.
and I would say like the goal is no pesticides.
Okay.
Just with part of the vegan ethics, you're trying your best within reason.
Right.
And defending crops. If it's between you having no crops or actually having a harvest, sometimes you do have to make hard decisions. But there are so many different ways to approach that and reduce usage and move towards a fully like veganic system where you don't need any pesticides. And we on our farm don't use any. There are like bacterial pesticides that you could use for things like caterpillars, but we don't find that we need those. We just try to grow the right crops at the right time and also promote biodiversity so we can completely avoid the pesticides. But also we're not growing at a hundreds of acre scale, so that's where it kind of gets into some of the gray area, I would say, within it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, modern industrialized food systems, like with any industrialized system, there is going to be problems that arise once you start to scale.
Right.
But I think the thing that's so interesting about what you're talking about is essentially it's like this symbiotic relationship that we have within our environment. And I think that your farm, your sanctuary, is a really good embodiment of that and a source of inspiration for myself. So thank you so much for your content and everything that you do, because it's very inspiring when I watch it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I find it can also be triggering sometimes for some of the non-vegan viewers. I do post some hunting content about how we work with things like, not things, but animals like coyotes or other predators, and how we, ethically and non-interventionally protect like our animals that we rescue, as well as like our crops. And that can be kind of triggering to some people. Some people don't believe I grew up in the country, or that, I have property, I have land, that I manage. So it's kind of amazing seeing the different replies when I like post something about how we work with nature, and we protect coyotes and we protect, wildlife. We don't hunt them or consider them pests. So sometimes that can be very upsetting to other non-vegan perspectives.
Yeah, no, it can be. And something that I've known or kind of seen in my experience, I've been plant-based for 11 years, vegan for 10 of those 11 years. And I've noticed that once you start to talk about some of these things, and you kind of, essentially all you're doing is holding up a mirror, and somebody might be upset about what they see in the mirror, but it's not about, because really, what are you doing to offend them? You're just not hunting an animal. But why is that offensive?
Right.
Like that should not be. You're not saying that I think that you're a worse person or I'm better than anybody. No, that is just simply you saying, this is what I'm doing, and then someone's like, I now feel bad about my choices.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that happens at a scale of like, this could be a one-on-one conversation about why you didn't put any cream cheese on your bagel this morning, or it could be a conversation that's much more in-depth about hunting.
Right.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe you mentioned last time we talked, you actually have a hunting background.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I grew up hunting. I grew up on a pine plantation in the kind of forestry industry. So I was heavily involved in outdoors. I was in Boy Scouts for a while. So that background for me was very, very deeply conditioned in me for seeing certain animals in the wild as resources, not as individuals. So that took a long time for me to kind of like deconstruct and understand that these animals do deserve basic respect. And there's not a good, logical reason why we need to be doing these things. It's not a valid, excuse for tradition or culture when there is a victim involved, and when you're going to go to the grocery store and buy something anyway, you're not surviving off of these practices typically, and it's very rare for that to happen. So for me, it was very difficult overcoming that. But through some different experiences that I had in hunting, I kind of like quickly came to that realization later in life, like this is not something I wanted to be participating in. It is unnecessary violence, and understanding the context of like the biodiversity crisis, how few wild spaces and wild animals are now remaining, especially within comparison to like farmed animals. It really just doesn't make sense to be continuing practices like that from my perspective. So yeah, it was. I think that's a pretty, not very common transition for people to make. But there are other former hunters who have made the switch. But it's definitely not easy when you still live in these areas where you're surrounded by that culture. So yeah,
I could only imagine. Yeah, it's I said this in a previous podcast, I think the one that's going to be airing right before this one, which is that, like, I mean, I get it. Like, I grew up in Texas. I mean, you're in South Carolina. Like, we get it. We understand. Like, hunting is a deeply ingrained part of the culture, but I also think that we will look back on a lot of our practices and roll our eyes heavily at the very least.
Yeah.
But it's I also understand like the camaraderie that comes from essentially the camping trip,
Yeah.
right? That comes with hunting, like venturing out into the woods. You know, we talked on the last time we attempted to record this podcast on forest bathing and immersing yourself in your natural environment and all of the amazing benefits that come from that. Like that is real.
Yeah.
And you should maybe, and instead of hunting the animals, like maybe let's go hunt some mushrooms.
Right.
You know, let's go forage some herbs.
Yep. Yeah. There's so many different nonviolent activities that you can do in nature, you know, that remove that like unethical part when you really step back and understand, you know, the exploitation that's happening. You know, and there's so many activities, like you mentioned, like foraging, birding and taking pictures, photography, videography, climbing, backpacking. You know, there's so many countless things. And in a lot of the debates that I have with hunters, like providing that context or that perspective, I should say, really kind of enlightens people as to like, you know, most people actually don't really want to go out and kill animals. You know, like most people would rather go and enjoy nature without that violent part. It's just there still is a lot of conditioning and a lot of culture or tradition reinforcing that hunting, you know, as a hobby or an activity. But I think, you know, the data that I've seen does show that more and more people are preferring compassionate options, you know, for enjoying nature. So I'm hopeful for that. So that's why I really enjoy like one-on-one conversations with hunters, because it's very easy to get lost in, you know, the comments and back and forth and just talking past each other. But when you really sit down and speak with someone, you can kind of help provide a little bit more details on a different perspective, you know, that could be obtained, you know, even for someone as far from a vegan stance as a hunter, you know, might be perceived. So I think it's a beneficial thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah, and I'm also just like, I guess a hippie at heart a little bit. Always kind of have been, which should not be a surprise to anybody who's listening to this podcast. But one of the things that I find myself kind of falling into kind of a naturalist category with is nature, which is like, don't fuck with it. Like, I think that the best thing that we can do as humans is just to be a part of nature in the ways that we can that are supportive of literally every ecosystem that surrounds us. But like, the less that we take from nature in a lot of ways, like through hunting or even a lot of industrial agriculture practices, like the more that we can find ourselves in a symbiotic relationship with nature, I think the better off we are.
Yeah.
So
I agree. And I think, you know, so much of it is about that respect. And I think a lot of hunters are brought up to have a certain amount of respect, you know, for wild spaces and wild areas. Like many people in the hunting community do consider themselves conservationists. And that's actually the debate I have very often is like, is hunting conservation? And I think a lot of it comes back to that conditioning that you have and viewing animals as a resource rather than individuals as part of an entire ecosystem. But I also think that there's some conditioning around like the idea of stewardship. That's something within Boy Scouts and, you know, a lot of other outdoors activities where you learn land and wildlife stewardship. But to really like deconstruct that around the maybe cultural conditioning that you've received versus like what does stewardship actually mean and how should we practice that given the context, you know, environmental crises and all of the rest of the relevant, you know, situation that we find ourselves in. You know, I think that like redefining or like re-examining what true stewardship is really critical for the future.
Let's shift gears a little bit towards like weather. Zoom out a whole lot, everybody, with me. Let's look at the climate as a whole. So we did kind of touch base on this topic a little bit. I know you mentioned things like methane with animal agriculture, specifically like greenhouse gases and things like that. Can you give us like a super basic walkthrough as to the animal agriculture system and how that contributes towards just overall climate change?
Yeah. So we definitely talked a good bit about like the biodiversity and land use impacts and how, you know, the expansion of industrialized agriculture specifically to continue feeding the industrialized animal agriculture system is contributing to, you know, those land use and biodiversity issues. But we're also having, you know, issues with just general practices within, the farming of plants, like we were talking about monocropping and some of these conventional systems of tillage, of synthetic usage of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides. These things are degrading our soils. And we're actually releasing carbon into the soil through a lot of these practices, whereas more regenerative or veganic practices would help to, sequester carbon. So moving towards a plant-based food system could have huge impacts for, emissions as well as biodiversity and land use. And I think another context to kind of apply here between the regenerative animal farming and the factory farming is something to think about with emissions comparisons between these two as well. Because when we look at emissions from grass-fed, animals, grass-fed cows versus feedlot cows that are fed grains, well, the grain-fed cows are growing quicker and they're producing a little less methane. Whereas the grass-fed cows are living longer because it takes longer to get them to size for slaughter. And they're also producing more methane, throughout that time. So, if we do actually care about the environment and conservationism or being a conservationist, we really need to look at, what we are contributing to with our diet and with other things, that we purchase because, these things have a huge impact on the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Yeah, so with that climate crisis, we did see a little bit of an effect of that. And when I say a little bit, I'm going to say a big bit of it, which is Hurricane Helene. Now, with what you understand about the environmental crisis that we're going through with everything with animal agriculture and agriculture in general, as you had mentioned, do you believe, in your opinion, that our farming practices, our animal agriculture practices that we have, are those directly contributing to like a higher frequency of these types of hurricanes like Hurricane Helene?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not helping. These are major contributors to these issues, to the warming, to the acidification of soils and water, to die-offs in oceans and lakes. All of these things are contributing, to the climate crisis. And I think taking a step back and looking at these practices and the things that we are contributing to with our dollars that we're purchasing, the products that we're purchasing, could have huge impacts. One thing I always encourage is like looking for local farms to support. Let's support the plant-based farms, and let's even encourage, farmers to maybe look into veganic agricultural practices, or regenerative agricultural practices for their farm if they don't want to get veganic certified. But supporting local farms, I think, is critical. There's so many different ways that we could address this issue. But I think one of the biggest things at a kind of government level is the subsidization of animal agriculture systems as well as the feed for animal agriculture. So that's something that just has consistently not changed. And it should. I'm pretty sure there's like UN reports about this, whereas the US is, among other developed nations that just refuse to change a lot of these subsidy systems that are propping up, these degrading conventional systems of agriculture. And we do need more farmers, like myself that are, willing to go out and invest in nature. And I think, agricultural practices should be a huge focus for going forward.
So we've touched base on quite a few different subjects here. So, of course, the H5N1, biodiversity, health of the environment and the ecosystem, the farming practices, all of that type of thing. Like, what are some solutions and practical advice? Like, what advice would you give to just everyday people who want to live more sustainably and support healthier food systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways. Obviously, your purchasing power is extremely important, where you're putting your money, but also, the activities you participate in are also contributing factors as well. How we treat the land we're responsible for or that we have access to is extremely important. One thing I really started getting very big into, even before understanding veganic farming, was not mowing as much. Just using less resources for, aesthetic purposes. Things like considering carbon sources in your yard, like leaves, or when you cut a tree down, what's happening to that carbon. Is it being wasted or is it being returned to the soil? There's so many different ways that we can look at that and contribute to improving soil and sequestering carbon just on maybe our small backyard or in community gardens, and talking to people, having these conversations about how we can make effective change, for these systems at a whole, but also at an individual level. I think a lot of people underestimate their ability to make change in their own life, and also how that change they're making can impact other people just through example. And that's something I'm having to learn, being here in South Carolina, surrounded by, a heavily non-vegan culture. I have ranchers and hunters who are, I'm still friends with, and I think maintaining those good relationships and being an example while not being antagonistic, or in people's face about it, you can still set an example in your own life, and I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, now we're talking. Yeah, that is like one of my favorite things in the world is not just be the change and all that, because that's also incredibly powerful and has the ability to move and inspire, but it's also just recognizing the amount of power that you do have in your life and how small changes. It's that whole metaphor of if you alter the course by 1 degree, it's an entirely different destination. Right. And the amount of power you have for change is massive in this world. Yeah, with a lot of things. So, yeah, make good choices, everybody.
Yeah, and I think that I was going to say, I think that's something that's been very important for me, like in my kind of development as a vegan, and kind of figuring out where I fit into the culture and, my community and things like that, and focusing on the things that you control rather than the things that you cannot control, and kind of letting those things you can't control go and really honing in. Like if something upsets you in the world, what can you do that makes you feel better and is an action that you might be contributing to that thing that you as an individual can do? And that was something for me that was just like huge for my mental health, and like not focusing on those things that are so stressful, and turning that stress or, that anger into something productive in your own life that can, move you forward towards the, goals that you want to have.
Indeed. Yeah, no, that is an incredibly powerful thing for sure. Yeah. So now you guys also run an animal sanctuary on your property there. And with that animal sanctuary, how many animals do you guys have now?
I think we're at 68 now. We did unfortunately lose a few of our older chickens. We had 2 chickens that were 12 and 11 years old, which is pretty old for a chicken. But they lived really great lives here. But yeah, we've got rabbits, or I like to say bunnies because they're cute and they're bunnies, man. Like, but so we've got bunnies, we've got goats, we've got lots of chickens, we've got some ducks. We also have some dogs and as well as 10 cats right now. So we've got 10. A full house. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of cats. Yeah. Okay. That age.
I think. I was going to say, I think since we last spoke, we got at least 2 more rescues. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, the stray cats, are a huge issue in our area. So we do some trapping, spaying, and neutering. We don't like to release because there are impacts, not only the H5N1 potentials, but also for the ecological impacts that cats can have. But yeah, we've got a good bit of cats.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I had no idea you had that many cats. That's incredible. Yeah. And it also makes sense why you kind of have this viewpoint and purview of the whole H5N1 situation. This is something that has a potentially large impact on you personally, more so than a lot of people. So
right. Yeah. I think we are in contact with a lot more species of animals than most people, probably are. But yeah, taking proper precautions, like none of our cats go outside unattended. We'll take them around on a stroller, or, walks like that. But we also have just built a catio, I think, since we last spoke as well. So
that's
we have,
cool.
We have a huge new kind of enclosed area outside that they can go, and it keeps them, away from contact with other birds, wild birds, or, stuff like that, wildlife, while they have a safe space to play and have fun.
That's great. Yeah. Also, I didn't even know that word existed. Catio.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's
Yep.
awesome. All right, perfect. So tell the people where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find my website, bentheveganfarmer.com. There on that website, you can find our other projects like Wild Pines Farm, as well as Wild Pines Sanctuary. The farm is a for-profit. The sanctuary is an animal rescue. And yeah, that's the main projects. We touched on the last time we talked on some of the foraging stuff that I do as well. So I do mushroom and plant foraging here on our farm. So you can find me on Carolina Wild Harvest, YouTube, all the socials for all of that, and Ben the Vegan Farmer on socials as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, thanks so much for taking the time and sitting down and talking to us today.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you.
Yeah,
as always.
likewise. Thanks, Andrew.